Indeed, it is.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the Anvil Media Brown Bag podcast, vodcast, webinar, whatever you want to call it. We're here today with Michael Perman from Say What and Craving the Future. I'll let him introduce himself, but we go back a couple of years when you first reached out and said, hey, I've got a podcast I'm doing that's going to tie to a book. It's going to tie to consulting and my speaking and all of that. Maybe we can get some help. And it's been fun to watch you evolve your podcast and your entire expertise as a futurist. So today we're going to talk specifically about being a futurist. What does it mean? How does it work? How do brands work with a futurist? What does that look like for you? And what can people take away from this experience to think about maybe hiring their own futurist? So, Michael, I'll hand it over to you for a quick introduction, and we can go to some questions.
Okay. I'm Michael Perman. I live in Portland, Oregon. Kent is right. I am a futurist. Some of the questions that Kent identify will explain the pathway and what that means. But I have, in general, had a path of a combination of being a chef, being an apparel trends watcher, and a variety of things in between. I make a really great shrimp scampi, and I think that's probably the only introduction you need.
Yeah, I think there's that. So let's talk a little bit about your journey. So how did you get into becoming a futurist? What does that look like?
So I came out of hotel restaurant school. I trained to be a chef, and eventually I went to work for food companies in the Midwest. There's a lot of big food companies in the Midwest. And one of the key skills of working in a food company is seeing what's coming. So I worked in product development and marketing, and it was important to understand what was on the horizon and how do we create products and services that were relevant to that. So I did that, and about half of my career was food. And at some point in time, I was in Portland, Oregon, and doing this type of work, got Nike as a client. And our project for Nike was for brand Jordan. When Jordan's sports stature was potentially waning, they asked the question, is brand Jordan a strong enough brand on its own, or should we keep it under the Nike label and tuck it under? And so we did research around the future of Jordan, and which actually led to the brand being separated, and it's still thriving today. And that sort of got me launched into the apparel business. And I worked for Levi's and Gap for 15 years. And after that, during that time, I did the same thing, did a lot of futures work relative to that. Being in consumer insights is an important part of being a futurist. It's about listening and empathy. When you're listening for the future, just have listening in a slightly different lens, because your job is to listen to something that doesn't quite exist yet and to recognize patterns that are in the midst of forming, as opposed to consumer insights, which is really about today and the present, and to some degrees diagnosis of the past. So that was generally my path.
Okay, great, thank you. So can you talk a little bit about what a futurist does? You talked at a high level of what that looks like, but what did you actually do? So brand Jordan, you bring up, that's a great example, because I was watching some elite, European football, AKA soccer, and one of the big teams has brand Jordan on their jerseys, which would seem to me to be a very far cry, that basketball to soccer / football. But you see it in American football as well, and not just basketball anymore. So let's use them, if it's okay, and as an example, because that was probably years ago, is what was the process to get to brand Jordan is strong enough because we did these things and it led to this insight, just at the highest level?
Yeah, I mean, at the highest level, let me kind of give some context to what a futurist does and then use that as an example. So, futurists are listeners and perceivers who recognize pattern before they become trends. So you can think of trends as a movement that's already happened for several years. It might keep going, but it's not a new thing. In order to be a trend, it has to have some history. Futurists notice nascent ideas that are not yet part of a trend, and they connect the dots to see patterns. In addition, futurists identify alternative scenarios that might exist. So you take what you believe are the facts, identify the scenarios on kind of a macro scale, like climate change would be a macro scale, or a more focused scale, such as the impact of the emergence of plant-based foods, on the restaurant business. In the case of Jordan, what we were seeing back then broadly is the continued rise of stars on a spiritual level. Certainly that was true with some musicians. Probably Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead is probably the best example of a musician as a brand that came to kind of a spiritual level. What we discovered in the case of Jordan, after a number of ethnographic insights and just kind of brailing what was going on in society at that time, was that he had that kind of spiritual level. He was quite pure. He had already shown his diversity because he went, if you don't recall, he was in the baseball league for a while as well. He left basketball and went to baseball. So he already sort of had this kind of Renaissance man quality to him. And that's what younger people, in particular, high school, early college, were admiring: the concept of Renaissance man, the concept of having a portfolio of interests. And as you can see, today, partly out of economic necessity, people have a lot of portfolios. They have social portfolios, they have hobby portfolios, and they certainly have job portfolios. And so we saw, in that case, Jordan as being so strong in that regard that it was almost an obvious choice to make his brand separate.
Very cool. That's that helps a lot. And it seems that you tapped the zeitgeist on that, and it seemed to be a great recommendation. Mm-hmm. So can you describe a little bit about, I think, your process? Maybe there's another a client example, whether it's a hotel or your past experience with Levi's or others, where was there a time where the process, it makes for a great case example of, like, beyond Jordan, like you took a different approach, it had a different outcome. Just I think one more example would be really helpful to try and triangulate this unique process.
Sure. Hyatt Hotels was a great project because they really embodied the sort of the full extent of what we do. I think you might find this in your business, that sometimes people take the full advantage of your capabilities and kind of your way of helping them. And sometimes, clients might cherry pick. And Hyatt did the full Monty. And for us, that means it's about 6 months of work, and it usually involves around 30 people. And it's really 4 phases, something we call new think. But starting first with understanding what's the problem to solve, what's the definition. So in the case of Hyatt, their value, their mission is to care for people away from home. And so the innovation challenge in that case, and sometimes these innovation challenges can take a month to really identify, because you're trying to align people. Everyone might have a different vision of what it is they're truly trying to tackle on the horizon. But if you think of caring for people away from home, the innovation challenge was, well, what does away from home mean? I mean, is it only a hotel? Or what are the other forms of away from home? And that led to all sorts of interesting things. So define the quest. The second one is around insights, and we do insights work with a typical consumer. In this case, they were business travelers, and then also with thought leaders. So we're generally a little bit tangential with thought leaders. So over the course of my career, where I've done dozens of these Futurist projects, we've interviewed firefighters, ballerinas, detectives, molecular biologists, ocean rowers, chefs. You're really trying to get people who think differently than you, and to infuse all that into a different way of understanding the problem that you're trying to solve. In the case of Hyatt, that meant a variety of professionals who care for people. So that was super interesting. Then that's phase 2. Phase 3 is identifying the scenarios that are impacting you. So there's, as I mentioned, there's macro scenarios and micro scenarios. So macro scenarios are the ones that every project is going to touch. So that's, the threat of virology, either biological viruses or internet viruses. Climate change is a universal kind of macro threat. Quantum computing and how that's going to affect all of our lives is another sort of macro force. But so depending on your specific futures project, sometimes people will ask me once they find out I'm a futurist, they'll say, well, what's the future? My response is always the future of what? Is this the future of food? Is it the future of cars? Is it the future of retail? So you're starting to narrow on the scenarios that impact your particular world. So macro and then more focused scenarios. And you're identifying, we create these things called curious clues. Curious clues are things that exist today, but in small amounts. So there's a famous futurist named William Gibson. He coined the term cyberspace. And the other interesting thing he once said was that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for these clues, this little thing that's happening here and there. There's a little restaurant in Brazil. There's a clothing company in South Africa. There's a digital farm in Norway. And we're trying to understand these things in the early stages. We'll also look to places like university labs, MIT Media Lab, for example. And then we also watch to see what the venture capitalists are doing, because they're usually funding things that are really early stage, especially places like Y Combinator, which is on the, kind of the seed level. And then it's a matter of piecing that all together and creating an opportunity forecast. Like, what's the forecast for your particular business in your particular category? And then what are the zones to play in? Our deliverables generally like somewhere around 3 or 4 opportunity zones, places to play that are meaningful for your business, from which a variety of products, services, and operational initiatives can emerge over a 3 to 5 to 10-year period. So it's like fertile ground. This is where the energy is going to be. This is where you should be playing. So we did that with Hyatt, and they ended up with a number of really significant projects that they're in the midst of working on.
Very cool. I think that helps shed a little bit of light on the process and how you come up with this. I think it's interesting also that when I asked you this question one-on-one, probably a year ago or more, maybe 2 years ago, and you're like, you don't go off in a room and just cook up some ideas on your own. It's a collaborative approach with the client, with all the constituents. But the idea of looking at what's being invested in, what people are talking about, I mean, it all goes into the process. So thank you for that. You've mentioned some of the clients you've worked with. What I'd like to make sure we have time for here is can you explain the ecosystem of, you started out as an expert with a consulting model, like many futurists, but then you started to develop the podcast when we first met while you were working on your book, and then you're doing speaking as well. So there's 4 legs to your stool. Do you want to just quickly talk about each of those so people understand your approach to being a futurist and how you communicate and get the word out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what's important, at least for me, in terms of being a futurist is, where do you focus? I tend to focus a little bit more on culturally relevant and evident concepts that are consumer-based, but also things that are more tangible. I would say I'm not much of a technology futurist. I think there's other people out there that are a little more tuned into that. So I'm more like food, music, culture, apparel, automobiles, more like things that consumers interact with on a regular basis. So when I started this podcast, I wanted a lot of diversity in the thinking of what futurism meant. And so, we interviewed, we had the future of space exploration, the future of learning, future of memory, which was really interesting because it was kind of a process in reverse. Our own Kent Lewis was on a great podcast around future of marketing and social media, future of coffee, future of sports. So it's been pretty diverse. And through the podcast, realized that, and through the podcast and actually probably another 50 interviews that I'd done that were not on a podcast, realized that I had a lot of content. So all of a sudden, the podcast became the content for the book, as well as kind of my methodology for doing creative work and my methodology for futures work and kind of my belief system around that became the book. The book became another venue for clients. So I say probably 100% of my clients now have received the book prior to me becoming a client. So it's been a fantastic tool for that reason. And it's also led to a number of other writing assignments. So wrote 5 articles for the Portland Business Journal. There's a Craving the Future hub on the Portland Business Journal. And then a number of other writing assignments for clients that are basically the future of something. So I love to write, and that's another leg on the stool. And then speaking, which was happening until COVID and, starting to potentially creep back. I'm going to be the MC for the Portland Business Journal Strategy Conference next month. And so that's going to have a future focused theme as well. I think those are the 4 legs, are they not, Kent?
I'd say that's a pretty solid description of a very sturdy chair. Thank you for that. So couple more questions. So number one, you've already actually, number one, for the coffee drinkers that are listening, can you summarize the future of coffee for us? Is it just a shot in the back of the head? What's coffee going to do? How's it going to evolve?
I don't remember anything about weapons in that conversation. So no, I don't think it's a shot in the head. I would say it's 2 things. One about regenerative agriculture, and so and fairness. So I'm on the advisory board for Fair Trade USA, so I'm pretty tuned into the coffee business and the importance of fair trade. And I think a lot of coffee roasters are now understanding the importance of that relationship with the people who grow the coffee. So it's either fair trade certified, and a lot of them are around direct trade, or maybe it's other forms, but something that says the sort of the economics of coffee are going to be about fairness, about regenerative agriculture, about less use of materials and that sort of thing. So that's, I think, number one. I think there's an insatiable demand for variety. So I think what's missing, or I would say still to come, is a sort of a different paradigm in the menu. Like if you really think of your coffee experiences, 99% of the places you go have the same menu. I'm going to get a cortado, I'm going to get a cappuccino, I'm going to get a latte. I think there's something that's going to start brewing on completely different drinks. I don't know exactly what those are, but I think it's one of the places where there's, innovation's been kind of lacking because so much of the emphasis has been on, either managing COVID or really getting the sustainability story together. Starbucks is deep into sustainability. The guy who runs sustainability at Starbucks was at Levi's. Dude knows what he's doing, and he's, no page unturned in terms of their desire to really have a sustainable future.
So that's extremely helpful. And I'm going to turn over to the team, see if they have any questions in a second. But can you tell us real quick, what are you working on right now that you can tell us, whether it's a specific industry or if you can name a client, but what's taking up your time right now?
Yeah, I can talk about categories more than the actual name, but future of candy. So that's super fun, as you can imagine. It's playful and intense, and there's all sorts of wonderful things. And there's a lot about what candy actually means, what confection means, to what degree is it healthy, what's its role in certain parts of the day. And so there's a lot of interesting things around that. And then meal kits. So some of you may have experienced meal kits like Blue Apron and that kind of thing. Anyone do that? Yeah. Okay. So as you may have noticed, there's a lot of packaging, right? And there's actually a fair amount of complexity for the simplicity that they desire. And so I think there's some interesting things happening there. We're working with a food company on the future of meal kits.
Very cool. That's very cool. Anybody on the team have a question you want to jump in on, or just send through the chat? Feel free to do that. One question here: what are you seeing right now, just overarching with trends today? What do you think? What do we need to be aware of in the next year or two that are coming? Because I know you, with the hotel client, you were looking, beyond 10 years, nearly 20 years out, as I
Yeah.
recall. What are you seeing that maybe you were doing research years ago, but what are you seeing that's going to really be impacting the listeners in the next couple of years?
Um, you know, climate change is real, and it's always kind of a weird way to start off a conversation like this, because it's true that not 100% of the people out there even understand that it's real, but it is. You're already, like, we're in a lovely place here because we're in Portland, Oregon, and there's lots of water, and there's like we're in our own little ecosystem. So it may not affect you, but we already know that insurance companies, for example, are refusing to insure certain kinds of homes because of the danger to them. And that's going to have a giant ripple effect, because then people are going to start to move out of where they are. They already are moving, but that mass exodus is going to happen. And I think at the same time, the understanding what regenerative means. So if you think like sustainability is what has started 15, almost 20 years ago as kind of a commercially relevant thing that brands were starting to get after. And now sustainability is kind of de rigueur. Regenerative design is the next level. And that's essentially re-establishing, rebuilding agricultural and living systems. So, most food companies, I don't know, maybe most is a hard word. A lot of food companies are putting billions of dollars into regenerative agriculture, switching the way farmers actually grow food. Dannon, General Mills, Nestle, Unilever. So that's one thing. Number two, I think it's going to be a couple of years more of hypervigilance, where you're going to have to freaking watch out for everything, right? You're already watching out for COVID, and you're watching out for, your systems being hacked, your personality, your profile being stolen from you and stuff like that. I think that the security measures that need to be in place to make us feel more comfortable are not been democratized. And I think everyone's going to have to be a lot more hyper vigilant. And at the same time, you'll see where I think that's maybe factually true. I think from a social and cultural perspective, I think more and more people are going to say, I don't give a shit, I'm just going to live my life. So there's that, it's kind of an interesting balance of what that is. And everyone's trying to figure out their own personal risk profile in however you define risk. And so that's kind of like this, a bunch of clothes in the dryer that are sort of wobbling around, and everyone's trying to figure out what their risk profile actually is.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware, if you're not on the social, which I'm pretty sure you are, but Facebook and its entire network has been brought down today. I don't know if it's the Russians, the Chinese, or a bunch of college kids, or maybe a 12-year-old, but what do you think, having seen this reaction? I'm sure they're losing billions of dollars. I remember when Microsoft about 20 years ago forgot to renew their domain, and it lapsed for a day, and it cost them like $100 million when their site was down for 24 hours. But that aside, what do you think? What would you want the listeners to know about social media and where it's going, as a futurist, and you're looking at meta issues and behaviors and sustainability, regeneration, and all these climate change, climate
Mhm.
disaster. So what's your take on social? How is that going to be evolving?
I think it's a wonderful thing if Facebook could be brought down entirely. That'd be, I've always had a point of view about that for several years. I don't, on a macro scale, I think the minuses exceed the pluses in terms of what that's done to a lot of people's behaviors. Some of it's been wonderful, some has been psychologically tormenting, some of it's sort of affected our society in really significant and gruesome ways. So I think there'll always be demand, but I think we'll start to see more and more selectivity of social media channels, more the way people are selective about other content, and I think we'll see, Facebook was a very democratized channel, right? Anyone could be on there for anything. But if you really think about what other content you pursue and listen to, it's a lot more focused. Either you listen to MSNBC or you listen to Fox, right? So I think some bifurcation or segmentation of social media is likely to happen as a result. I think it'll become a lot more intuitive as well, especially in a different level of omnipresence as we move from virtual reality systems to more common devices like glasses that are broadcasting and interpreting content. So, you'll be the use of virtual reality can become more democratized, and the use of your ability to communicate more fluidly will become democratized by this as well, when that actually happens. I don't know.
Yeah, that answers
something more specific about that?
No, I think that helps. I guess the follow-on would be, have you watched any of the Black Mirror shows in the
No,
series?
I don't watch that show.
That's a bummer because it's basically a take of we got 10 minutes here, but be that as it may, it takes Black Mirror is a black screen and it reflects us and our in a relationship with technology. I think it's definitely worth you watching as a futurist, especially with a depth of knowledge of technology. And there's one episode with Ron Howard's daughter in a dystopian normal looking world where we have our devices, our phone, there's a contact lens. That's a recurring theme, is a contact lens, computing, and AR, but that you constantly rate each other 5 stars. And those with 5 stars get VIP access. By the time you're 1 or 2 stars, you're exiled from the community, from society. So it's definitely worth watching. I would love your POV on that. There's others about like robot dogs that take over the planet, not to be a spoiler alert. But just, they look at things and kind of like when technology gone bad, it's almost every single one of them is dystopian, but in a very, I think, fairly accurate reflection of how the technologies, whether it's social or some other type of everybody's driving EV vehicles, for instance. That's just the game. That's table stakes. So it's really looking at where behavior goes and how technology, our relationship with technology. So there's that. And speaking of that, one of our team members asked, was there a specific incident or a point at which you decided, I'm definitely becoming a futurist? You mentioned you started in food and the restaurant industry, but what was there a particular inflection point? Or was it a gradual slow boil of the frog in the frying pan? You're like, suddenly you're a futurist.
No, that's a great question. I think the answer is 2001 at Levi's. I don't know if you probably don't know Levi's history, but Levi's in the late 90s was huge and vibrant. And if you think of compare the dollars of 1998 to now, they were a $7 billion brand in 1998. And they went to 6 a year later, and they went to 5 billion a year after that, and they went to 4 billion a year after that. So they lost $3 billion in revenue in 4 years. So the leaders at the time said, what did we just miss? And in fact, they did. They had missed hip hop as a cultural force in terms, I mean, I think the music people in our company were totally tuned into it, but in terms of fashion, it's one of those things where you look at it and you think, well, that's small. Don't worry about it. It's just a little bit, it's growing, by the time you realize that it's big, you've completely missed it. Levi's was also never really that big in the women's business.
Yeah.
So that was a giant miss too, because that's where women's jeans where the jeans business was heading. So I was sort of asked by the president at that time to do what they call a zeitgeist. And a zeitgeist means, it's a German term, means the spirit of the times. So it's essentially a view of the future. So I had a team, 15 people, and that, we put that thing together and presented it to the company. And I mean, it was an amazing experience to do. And then I would say 3 years later, we did a couple more of them, but as time went on, more and more of what we had perceived to be the future became the reality. And I'm like, oh, I get it. This system works.
Yeah.
So I would
Very
say
cool.
that I got bitten by the bug.
Very cool. Now, I want to make sure we don't run out of time here. We've got a few more minutes. Let's ask now instead of the very end. You'll have one last question is how can people find you? What's the best way for people to get to know Michael Perman better?
Okay. Thank you. It's www.saywhat.org. So CESTWHAT.org is probably the best way. The book Craving the Future is available on Amazon and basically any other book site. I think those are probably the best ways to find me.
Great. And I know that if you Google Michael Perman, you'll find his speaker bio and credentials if you're ever looking to get a speaker in. We got the friends and family discount here today, but he's well worth bringing into your organization to look at the future. Speaking of that, and thank you for being on today, Michael. I want to end on this. NFTs, non-fungible tokens. I've been talking and preaching the choir since before Gary Vee decided it was the future earlier this year, basically. And we're working on a couple projects. We just wrapped up this NFTmural.org project, a physical mural in a building combined with some NFT digital artwork.
Yeah.
And so I'm just at, what is your 1 minute take on NFTs? Because you've got banks now looking at it. You've got, it's in the supply chain. It's, it's beyond crypto. It's into products and big brands. So what's your 1 minute recap of NFTs and where they're going?
I'll take a minute. So I'll just say, one of the things that we revealed at Levi's in our 2005 Zeitgeist was something called content meritocracy. So content meritocracy said it's a phenomenon whereby people's status in society and perhaps their economic value would be rewarded by the degree to which they created content. So 2005, Facebook was still a college dorm project and YouTube was just a place to upload your videos so somebody else could see it, right? So I think that concept of content meritocracy is alive and well. I adore the concept of that ideas are being rewarded as much as tangible objects. So I think that's great for NFT. And I think there's even before NFT, there were other artists who were having that level. Saul LeWitt is an artist from the 60s who creates plans to be drawn on walls. They're one of a kind. You can't replace it. They have to exist on that wall. And that's similar to what a lot of the NFT, like the mural you did over the weekend, Kent. JR is a social cause artist that creates giant posters of socially relevant people and puts them all over cities. And of course, Banksy would be an example.
Yeah.
So I think a future that creates value for original works is in a democratized way is fabulous. And I look forward to next year or whenever it comes so that the ability for anyone to register an NFT will be more democratized and more simple. I think the only downside that's weird is that tremendous amount of energy, just like crypto, the tremendous amount of power required. And you think of, well, is that the right way for our society to devote energy? Is that, if we had to solve a lot of problems, including climate change, is that the right place to put our energy? But I love that people are getting paid for ideas.
That's great. Well, thank you, Michael. We appreciate your time today on our Anvil Media Brown Bag. We will be posting this video, if you're probably already watching it, on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And you can find Michael at saywhat.org, CESTWHAT.org. And there it is. If you're French, you get it. If you're not, you need to take French. And you can find more about Anvil and our podcast at anvilmedia.com. But thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Michael, for being a guest. It's always a pleasure. And we will see you in and around the future.
Right on. Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Pleasure
Take
to be
care.
with you today. Cheers.
Bye-bye.